Microphone check, 1, 2.
Friends and members, our program will begin in approximately 5 minutes. Please begin to take your seats. Friends and members, welcome to Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. Thank you for joining us for the journey of the Jackson home. Please turn your attention to the video monitors for a special video about the Jackson home.
I feel as if this house will finally go home. Its journey to the Henry Ford in Michigan represents a whole new chapter, a whole new life. And so many generations yet unborn will be able to touch and feel this wonderful house.
We were warned that this project in particular was not normal in any way in terms of the size of the load and the distance that we were traveling. So we knew going in that it would be an unknown route up until close to the last minute.
When you talk about the permitting and the potential hurdles that you could encounter, whether it be curfews, reverse curfews, the highway and derating, escorts, bucket trucks, there's no way to underestimate the complexity of this. A lot of this was real time, which made it that much more difficult.
During the move, the house movers would find a suitable location to park a structure this size each evening, and then leave and go and find a hotel.
So we're here in a rented 30-foot mobile home with a security team. You know, we have duty of care for our staff at the Henry Ford, and we have to have duty of care for our artifacts. We have to be here to make sure that nothing happens to it on the way up.
Every evening when we stopped, I went in
Hi, guys. Thanks for coming out on a Saturday. We're super excited. I'm Heather. I'm Curator of Political and Civic Engagement, and I'm going to talk to you today. We're all going to talk to you today, but I want to start out by talking a little bit about the pop-up exhibit that we have and about the Voting Rights Act. And so hopefully you guys learn some stuff, and it'll be really exciting. I am using technology that I have not used before. The button is not working.
You know, technology works until you need it to, right?
I know.
All right.
So,
I'm just pushing it, right? There we go.
Yay.
well, let's.
There is no sound.
Well, in the meantime, while we work on sound, what you all are seeing in front of you is the special video about the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act that is
saying whatsoever.
Oh, there we go.
So when I think about the right to vote, I think about it as a foundational measure that sets up the United States to be what it ends up being. When you turn 18 here in the United States, you can register yourself to vote. You go into your Secretary of State or your DMV office, and you sometimes fill out a little card, name, address, show your ID. But it wasn't always that way. If you were a person of color, particularly a black person, there were barriers that were put up in order for you to be able to vote.
African Americans during this period did not have their full access to the vote, even though on paper they did via the 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments. However, African Americans were barred their access to the vote in a number of ways. For one, you might have a literacy test, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, which made it so that if your grandfather was able to vote, you were able to vote, which of course for most African Americans at the time was not valid. You might have a bar of soap. How many bubbles are in this bar of soap? And the point is to make it as ridiculous as possible so that those folks who are trying to register end up getting discouraged, end up getting turned away. Voting becomes a major issue for African Americans for a number of reasons. Not having the right to utilize that American right doesn't sit well with most people. The voting rights movement in Selma, Alabama had several major figures and organizations.
I think the one that sits on everybody's mind first and foremost is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He seems to be the face of the movement.
People like Dr. King are great mobilizers, but ultimately the power lies within us, the people. There's no better representation of the activities of everyday people than the Selma voting rights movement. And that is really embodied in the story of Dr. Sullivan and Richard Gene Jackson, of whose home was open to the world by opening it to their dear friend, Dr. Martin Luther King, who stayed with them during the height of the Selma voting rights movement.
A lot of people wonder why Selma, why this tiny little town in Alabama. There was a lot of tension that was happening in this area. Groups like SNCC had already been on the ground in Selma doing the work, trying to register people to vote. There's a march that's organized between a number of the groups on the ground there in Selma. And the march is going to be from Selma to Montgomery. They start the march, they get to the infamous Edmund Pettus Bridge, and violence erupts.
They were attacked, harassed, beaten by Alabama State Police. Hundreds of people were injured. The fallout from this was tremendous. So with the passing of the Voting Rights Act, these challenging barriers are made illegal.
We needed the 1965 Voting Rights Act to ensure that everybody, women, men, black, white, and myself as an Indigenous person, benefits also from the 65 Voting Rights Act because we're all now able to cast our ballots.
One of the most uniting factors of the civil rights movement, but especially the Selma voting rights movement, is ordinary people putting everything on the line for our collective benefit.
So what are you willing to put your life on the line for? What are you willing to walk for, march for, or lay down for?
is you can go over to the pop-up and you can see this video. It's important because this is in a monumental year. This is the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And I think now more than ever, there's so much at stake. And so we want to make sure that people understand the history of the Voting Rights Act and understand what the act did itself. And I'm pushing a button again. And there we go. Oh.
Go back.
I pushed it too many times, you guys. Okay, there we go. I do public speaking. You think I would know how to use technology. It's fine. Okay, so the Voting Rights Act was the end result of what happened in Selma, the march from Selma to Montgomery. And I'm not going to spend a super long time about it because I do think people generally have an idea about it. But on March 15th, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson gives a speech, and it's primarily known as the "We Shall Overcome" speech, because he uses that line, that significant line, that's a signal to those in Selma on the ground doing the work, saying, hey, I hear you, we're gonna do something about this, and you have my commitment to it. And so finally, in August 6, 1965, the act is passed. And that means you can vote. The barriers to being able to vote should be removed. Barriers that shouldn't have been in place in the first instance. With the passage of the 15th Amendment, passage of the 19th Amendment, we should have been able to access the ballot box, but it doesn't happen. And it's really important to note that it was ratified 95 years after the 15th Amendment. So after formerly enslaved men, particularly, were given the right to vote, 95 years later, that right is now guaranteed to everybody. And the act has seen its fair share of trouble throughout the rest of the decades, but we are consistently fighting to make sure that the act itself and people have access to the ballot box. You may have heard of something called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is to restore part of the 1965 Civil Rights Act that was taken out in the Supreme Court case Shelby v. Holder. I will not bore you with the details of this Supreme Court case, though I do love law and policy. We could talk about it for hours, but I'm not going to do that. So it's important. This is a significant piece of history that people fought for and people died for. Including, there were indigenous activists, there were black activists, and there were white people from the North who came down to make sure that people had the right to vote. This was the video you guys just saw, but I do want to talk a little bit about the pop-up itself. So the pop-up that we have, which is over by this place and time, talks about not only the significance of the Voting Rights Act, but also what was happening on the ground in Selma. Who was there, and we introduced you to the Jackson family. And these are just some of the objects that we have that are in there. So the Life magazine from March 1965 that talks about, inside it talks about the speech that Johnson gave, but also what was going on the ground, the hard times, the turbulent times that people were facing. We Shall Overcome, a songbook of the movement itself. Music is so important in any movement. If you think about the big movements that we've had throughout history, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it is anti-war Vietnam movement, music plays an integral role. And it's so important. And so we've got that songbook on display for people to see. And then, do all Americans have the right to vote? This was written in 1939. It was really talking about, does everybody in the United States have the right to vote? No, not in 1939. Not everybody did. And so we're really exploring the history of voting in this exhibit, and we're also introducing you to the Jackson family at the same time. So not now, but when we're done here, I want you to go over and see it and look at it and learn a little bit more.
Thank you, Heather. Yep. So now I'm going to give you a little bit more background. So Heather obviously is telling you about the pop-up exhibit, 60th anniversary, but now let's go a little bit more about the details about the Jacksons themselves. On your left-hand side of the screen, you see Dr. and Mrs. Sullivan Jackson on their wedding date in March of 1958. On the right is Miss Joanna Jackson, who is their only daughter, who reached out to the Henry Ford in 2022, looking for a new steward for her family story. She had been operating her family's home as a museum after her mother's passing in 2013, and was basically looking for additional support. and especially thinking about the environmental and economic issues around maintaining a home as those costs always add up. And so when she reached out to us specifically, she knew that the Henry Ford in particular was uniquely capable of being able to not only just preserve her family's story, but to keep it as one big package. You know, oftentimes with museums, you take a piece here and you take a piece there, and they end up going all across the country. It was really important for her because her family made sure that every artifact, every item that touched or was touched by individuals in 1965 was maintained in the house. And so we have a really unique opportunity to explore that. Dr. Sullivan was a dentist. He's a World War II veteran. After going back to school, after returning home from the war, goes to Meharry Medical College in Nashville, which is a part of the HBCU, Historic Black College System, all throughout the South, and decides that he's going to move down to Selma. He's being raised in Indiana as a child, living with a sibling who basically adopts him as her own, and decides that he's going to return back to the place of his birth to be closer with his family. He also tends to meet a wonderful woman named Richie Jean Jackson, Richie Jean Sherrod, excuse me. And Miss Sherrod, let me tell you, is a woman who is uniquely connected. She is, and I think if you have seen other videos about Jackson House featuring myself, I've mentioned Black Girl Magic a lot. And Miss Richie Jean is a great embodiment of that because she comes from a unique background, a free person of color. Her family is a group of people known as Free People of Color. Immediately after the Civil War, they become sort of the foundational community that grows into the Black middle class along the Alabama Black Belt. So this is all along Highway 80 in the middle of Alabama, going from Hammer all the way over to Montgomery. Excuse me. And so she is incredibly well connected. Her family, again, establishes this Black professional class in Selma. They're doctors, they are dentists, they are teachers, they're ministers, they're university professors, because Selma University is in town. In fact, just a block away from where the Jackson's home stood at 1416 Lapsley Street. And so she's incredibly well connected, and she also, because of these connections, has a unique perspective and unique connections to other future representatives of the civil rights movement, including a young woman who took professional music classes with her distant cousin, a woman that she became very close friends with, Miss Coretta Scott, later King, right? They literally know everybody, and it's been a really interesting ride to learn more about their story. And so the Jacksons get married in 1958, and they become very close and very friendly, again, reconnecting with Coretta Scott, now King, and her husband, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when he is the minister of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, not too far away from where they are. They're connected via the aunt cousin who owns the home that is built for her at 1416 Lapsley Street that then becomes the Jackson home. And so everybody is very interconnected. This sets the tone and the stage for why Dr. King is here, and specifically in this house, because they had been friends for a very long time. And these friend connections and these professional connections really are through lines for the African American community, but especially for movement makers in the civil rights movement. It's the Black professional class that whose money fuels payments, who fuels the successes of SCLC, that at the same time also provides space like the Jacksons did in various aspects where they weren't at, say, Dr. King's home base in Atlanta. So a few other additional points in the long civil rights movements just to get us oriented to where we are in this moment. Of course, you all aren't too far from, and as members, you all know that we host a major artifact from this long civil rights movement. The bus that Mrs. Rosa Parks took her stand or sat down to take a stand on, December 1, 1955, just sitting right over here in our Liberty and Justice for All exhibit. So that is one half of the bookends that we're able to tell through this through-line story via the Jackson House, starting with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, the Montgomery bus boycott, the largest and most successful boycott in the history of America, 1955, running all the way through 1963 with the Birmingham campaign and the Children's Crusade, the March on Washington in 1963, and of course the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What I want to make sure that you all understand as part of this large experience of the Jackson family and the civil rights movement, specifically the voting rights movement, is that it took lots and lots and lots of people putting themselves at great personal risk to make long-lasting change for all of us. A lot of the people that you will see both in the exhibit and on the screen today suffered major, major hardships because they decided to go up against white supremacy via the law and via the violence of individuals and groups like, say, white citizens councils, the Klan, and of course, the Alabama State Police and other local law enforcement. This was not a event on top of, obviously, the violence of Bloody Sunday and other acts of violence. This was not an event that was taken lightly by anybody, including Dr. and Mrs. Sullivan Jackson. The Jacksons, in fact, had to have a plan for what to do with their very young child in the height of this movement. They had the Klan marching in front of their home. There were instances where they thought bombs were placed under their house. Imagine waking up at around midnight and hearing somebody crawling around the bottom of your house who then comes to the door, happens to be the main security officer for the city of Selma, who says, "Oh, don't worry, we didn't find a bomb this time," right? Having to think about, well, if someone were to come and want to attack our family, want to attack our friends who are here, what do we do with our 5-year-old? Having to think about putting your daughter into a laundry basket and putting her over the back fence, hoping that a friend or family member would come and get her, right? So this struggle, this movement, the work that we're doing, all of this is allowing us to be able to tell this much deeper story, and the house symbolizes that. So I want to make sure to get that through before we move forward. These people in particular on your screen, the Courageous 8, these are members of the Dallas County Voters League who probably took the brunt of the local challenges head on. These individuals, specifically Mrs. Marie Foster and Mrs. Amelia Boynton, y'all might recognize her name in particular, as well as the gentlemen surrounding them, are basically on the front lines starting around 1960, 61 or so. Why? Because the Dallas County Voters League takes the place of the NAACP during this time because it is made illegal in the state of Alabama. Lots of other states are doing a similar thing starting in the 50s because they recognize the power the NAACP has to push against the status quo in these areas. And a lot of states, including Texas, South Carolina, Georgia, all work to try and make a organization like the NAACP illegal. And so it becomes the work of local activists first taking the charge for these things, for these issues, led by these important people. I also want to make sure that you realize that, again, this is a very small town. Everybody knows everybody, including Miss Marie Foster is the sister of Dr. Sullivan Jackson. She served as his hygienist in his dental office as well for her entire career, or most of her career, once Dr. Sullivan came back to Selma in the late 1950s. So everybody's interconnected, everybody knows everybody, and it's, again, a collective effort of people both locally and nationally. So here's a brief timeline of the Selma Voting Rights Act, some major things you want to be aware of. The work that happens between Dallas County Voters League taking over from the NAACP in Dallas County, Selma, city of Selma, is elevated by the invitation and the acceptance of the invitation by SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who first come down in February of 1963 with the leadership of Bernard Lafayette, who, again, this is the student-led part of the movement. For many people during this time, or a lot of people now, we tend to think of SCLC, they're the old timers. And when I say old timers, they're in their 30s at this particular point. SNCC, these folks are young. They start cutting their teeth initially with the sit-ins of 1960, the Freedom Rides in 61, Mississippi Freedom Summer in 64. They are doing a whole bunch of work all across the country. But it's in 63, they come down to Selma and start doing this important work, including Freedom Day registration in Selma. They are, again, getting the brunt of a lot of this initial action, including violence, okay? And so in 64 or so, Martin Luther King is invited by the Dallas County Voters League to come back down and assist them in this voting rights movement that's happening. That brings a little bit of tension, a little bit, that's putting it lightly, a little bit of tension between SCLC, SNCC, but at the end of the day, Dr. King and SCLC are looking to be invited to places to kind of rectify these sorts of tensions that they're getting in other parts of the country, including from SNCC and other aspects. But what's really important and what's really critical about this invitation is that MLK and SCLC bring media attention. They bring a lot of eyes whenever they show up places. So in addition to having the funding and the assistance of the kind of Black professional middle class all throughout the South, there's also the media. There's all of this TV, which comes into play majorly in this instance. Oh, excuse me. All righty, so here we are, height of 65. Dr. King comes and stays with his friends, Sully and Richie Jean, starting in January through about June of 65. During this time, it's a lot of stuff going on. In February, early February, SNCC and SCLC decide that they are going to attempt to register people to vote, about 250 people or so, and they are all arrested in one fell swoop in early February of 65. Dr. King writes a similar letter that he wrote when he was arrested in Birmingham, so a letter from a Birmingham jail, you may have heard of that. He also wrote a letter from a Selma jail that is less popular, less well known, but has a similar vibe to it at the same time. In February, also late February, February 18th of 1965, we have the first martyr of the Voting Rights Act movement. It's important to know that there are 4 martyrs, and you all, being very active and knowledgeable Detroiters, should know at least one that we'll talk about in a little bit. The first martyr is Mr. Jimmy Lee Jackson of Marion, Alabama. He is a very young man. He's about 24 or so, and he is protecting his mother from being attacked by Alabama police during a march for voting rights in Marion. It is in his memory that SCLC, SNCC, and Dallas County Voters League decide that they are going to start to plan a march from Selma to Montgomery. It is this march that becomes the centerpiece of this movement. Okay? On March 7th, 1965, that was going to be an attempted date, the first date of this first attempt at a march. But as we know, on March 7th, 1965, the group, Dr. King was not at the head of this line. It was 2 people, one representative for SNCC, which was soon to be Congressman John Lewis. The other representative from SCLC is Mr. Reverend Hosea Williams. Those 2 are leading this march. They march from Brown Chapel, which is an AME church in Selma, leading a group of hundreds towards Highway 80, crossing over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they are met with absolute destructive violence. This violence, in particular, is incredibly well documented. You can go on YouTube today and see those videos, and I highly encourage you to do so, to see the absolutely immense brutality that it takes to put down people demanding the rights promised to them as American citizens. These are Americans who are beaten until to an inch of their lives. John Lewis had his skull fractured in several places this day. In fact, in this bottom photo where there's a woman being propped up by several other people, that's Mrs. Amelia Boynton, who had been attacked full on, billy clubs, run over by horses, the brutality cannot be underestimated and cannot be understated. And so, again, these are American citizens asking and demanding for their rights to be recognized, who are then met by this violence by the state of Alabama. Okay. So March 19th, we get March 9th, in between the 7th and the 9th, Dr. King asked for a number of American clergy to come down to Selma, to come back up the protesters there on the ground, and he is met with an amazing outcry of support. You have all kinds of religious communities who come down to Selma, and the community of Selma, just like the Jacksons, open up their doors to the world and offer space to those people. So the second attempted march is March 9th, 1965. With the Turnaround Tuesday March, they march basically from Brown Chapel over to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, kneel in prayer, turn around, go back into Selma. That night as well, we have the second martyr of the voting rights movement who is attacked, Reverend James Reeb, who's a Unitarian Universalist pastor coming down from Wyoming. He is attacked by, he and two other members of his clergy are attacked by white supremacists. He's beaten and killed. He dies a couple of days later. A significant date coming right after that, March 15th, that is the date of Reeb's funeral or memorial service there in Selma. Dr. King delivers the eulogy. That night, everybody returns back to the Jacksons' home, and we have the famous image of Dr. King in the Jacksons' living room watching LBJ deliver his "We Shall Overcome" speech. So this "We Shall Overcome" moment with the photo combined with the artifacts that we've collected in the home, connected with the home itself, allow us to tell a unique intersection, a unique opportunity to talk about this intersection of a place where it happened, with documentation of how it happened, where it happened, and the importance of why it matters today, right? So a couple more things, and then I will be passing it on to my friend Jim here. So the successful Selma to Montgomery March happens a few days later, March 21st through the 25th, going all along Highway 80 from between Selma and Montgomery. It's about 80 miles or so, and it's cold, it's rainy, but people are in good spirits. People are feeling this sense of pride and this sense of power within their community. And of course, the march ends in Selma. Dr. King delivers an amazing speech, which I'll show you a clip of in just a moment. But also that same day, we have our third martyr of the voting rights movement, and that is Detroiter Mrs. Viola Liuzzo. Mrs. Liuzzo had heard that call that Dr. King had sent out just a few weeks earlier. She was a student at Wayne State, my alma mater, where she, as a mother of 5 children, could not remain inactive. And she drove down to Selma and helped out where she could. And the day that she was murdered, she was driving back and forth, moving people from the front of the march to the back of the march, driving people back and forth on I-80, where she, too, was killed by white supremacists, okay? And so all of that to accumulate and to come to the August 6th Voting Rights Act signing by LBJ. Does that mean that the story is over? Of course not. The story is never over. The fight continues. In fact, the fourth martyr of the movement is murdered just a couple of days later. His name is Reverend Jonathan Daniels. He is also a Unitarian Universalist, and he's working with SNCC in Lowndes County, which is the next door county to Dallas County, where Selma is. And so there are a number of people whose roles to play in this are giving up everything, literally everything, in order for us to have a future that they would never see. And so it's really important that as we are pulling together all of these aspects of this home, doing all this really important work and getting it ready for the public to be able to view in 2026, that we also remember the why and the reasons why these things matter, why history matters. So, all right, and here's the march kind of link there. So there's, as I mentioned, there's some really awesome pictures and really awesome well-documented material that come not only just with this house, but with this movement. And so we have a really unique opportunity to highlight this very well-documented event in our collective history. So obviously here is the home, and I think I might be touching into where you are, Jim. So there we go. I'm gonna hand it right on over to you.
All right,
my friend.
thank you. Thank you, Amber. All right, we're going to talk a bit about the house. Yeah, go ahead, thank you. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the process of discovery, the way that we are really, what we're using to learn about the house itself, and our ultimate goal is really preserving the house, restoring the house, and having it represent the way it would have looked specifically in that area, that time of 1965, when all the things that Amber and Heather were talking about were actually taking place in and around Selma, in and around the house. But we are very cognizant of the fact that this is much more than just a period house restoration. We are very mindful of the fact that really, despite Richie Jean's huge efforts to make it a safe haven for her family and Dr. King and all the others that, answered the call and came there to Selma, those that came through the house, we were mindful that all kinds of things were going on that threatened the family. The phone calls, constant the phone ringing. You didn't have caller ID. You'd answer the phone, and it could be a family friend checking in. It could be an important call for Dr. King. It could be the White House. That happened quite a bit. It could also be really kind of venomous, racist threats that were coming in, because there was a public phone. They didn't have a private number. They were in the book, so that was an issue. To have people looking for bombs under the house, to have the need to bundle off their daughter over the fence when things got a little too hot. So those are all the things that we're mindful of as we're putting this restoration together. And there's a huge amount of detective work. You saw the initial video of the move of the house. That was a major undertaking into itself, to say the least. But the process of discovery that we've been working through these past, it's been going on almost a year and a half now, has been pretty fascinating. And we're learning a lot. We're learning all about the house. We're learning about the house's history. So we'll go through some images. I'm going to share quite a few photos, family photos and things that have been guiding us quite a bit in trying to figure out exactly what this house looked like in that snapshot of 1965. So this is a very early sort of diagram of the house as we understood it when we were first sort of starting the project. So at the top, of course, is the front porch. The area in yellow would be the original portion of the house. The house is built in 1919. It's a arts and crafts southern bungalow. It was designed by one of the few formally trained African-American architects in this country, who was initially associated with Tuskegee, but had his own firm in Birmingham. We'll talk about him in a little bit. The darker shade is the first addition put on the house, we believe, in sometime in the early 1950s. And the white section would be a 1970s addition that Joanna's family put on. So each of the families, again, occupied by 3 families of dentists over nearly 100 years, each putting their own stamp on the house. The Whitted family, as she's referred to as Cousin Leola, had the house built for her by her father, who lived right next door, as a wedding present in 1919. She lived there until her husband's death in 1940. Eric Portlock and his wife, Benny, who partnered with Dr. Whitted, moved into the house in 1940, and they occupied the house all the way up until Dr. Portlock's death in 1955, and ultimately Mrs. Portlock remained with the Jackson family, and she would pass away in 1968. So she was a feature in the house for a good many years as well. And of course, the Jacksons move into the house around 1958 or so. Each family puts its own stamp on the house. So here we have the floor plan excuse me, of how the house would have looked in 1965. So this includes that 1950s addition off the back, which we're fairly certain was done by the Portlocks as kind of a suite for Mrs. Portlock's mother, Mrs. Gardner, who moved in and lived with them. It was a bedroom, sort of a small sitting room den area, and an additional bathroom. And that really was the footprint, still very much in place in 1965. Very quick, for those that have not been out to the village to see the ongoing, because the house is in the village, it's got a roof now, it's moving right along. This is the sort of location of where the house is in the village, not too far off the village green along Maple Lane, basically taking its place in that neighborhood there on Maple Lane. So these are some of my photos from the very initial visit that we did, which at that point, it was just kind of an exploration to see if what this was and if any of this was going to be possible. We knew very little about the house at that time, and it was kind of, it's always fascinating to just kind of do sluicing and just looking at the house and listen to the house and tell what it's telling you about what's happened to it over time. So these are images up the sides, which frankly did not change very much over the course of the house's history, with the exception of all the additions and things that were put onto the house. This is the view from the back of the house in its final iteration, with the family room in place, and then another, the 1970s version of a carport and different things. Typically, the driveway was used, but, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but most of the folks that were coming in 1965, the people in King's entourage, they were coming to the back. They were coming sort of a little bit incognito, coming into where it was safer to come and go from the house. So the rear portal of the house is important. The windows remarkably survived throughout the house. Different iterations over the different times of remodeling in the house, but they were never replaced, and we will be able to preserve them and put them back in place. They'll be refinished to some degree, but that's a great thing to have that original component still surviving with the house. And this may not seem very exciting to most people, but it is sort of to me. This shows us some of the original foundational stones. The house is basically built up on little plinths with infill in between it. This house has kind of a half cellar in it, really not an area intended to be going down into. It's mostly kind of a service area. But interestingly, the infill between these pylons, these little things that the house was up on, the brick sections, which are original, is this very distinctive brick, which would show up throughout the house, on the front porch, inside in the new remodeled fireplace, but was also used for this infill in the 1970s to sort of upgrade the house. And we know that over time the house underwent sort of maintenance type improvements. So the original narrow painted clapboard siding was sided over with this asbestos cement board siding, which came in a color, but eventually was painted many times in the house's history. The roof was changed over from a wooden shake at some point to a metal shingled roof, probably sometime in the middle part of the 20th century. And the front porch underwent some of the more dramatic changes, sort of in coupled iterations. So the front porch of the house, and we have really no formal portraits of the house before the 1970s, 1980s, but we are able to capture certain elements of what its original configuration was by these family snapshots, and we're going to see some of these in a couple minutes. But we know in the 1970s, the front porch underwent a massive renovation with the very distinctive brick being used as sort of the railing, if you will, incorporating the plinths that would hold up these iron columns. And this mosaic floor was added to the porch, replacing the original wooden deck that was there probably from the inception of the house when it was first built in 1919. So a quick walk through the interior of the house as we found it. Amber did mention that Joanna pretty much kept the house as her mother left it when she passed away in 2013, with a few tweaks when she opened her museum, which she and her partner Jim personally operated, and they gave private tours. They weren't even living in Selma at the time. They lived in Pensacola, Florida, and it was a huge, huge undertaking, and they did manage to tour several thousand people through the house every year. But it was pretty much as Richie Jean left the house, and we do know the interior of the house underwent pretty big renovations in the 1970s, covering up the walls that had been initially wallpapered and then painted over. And a lot of that wallpaper began to peel and kind of fail with the paint and things on it, so the decision was made to drywall the entire house sometime in the early 70s. And in doing so, a lot of the original trims and things were sort of cut back, removed, and things like that. But they did not use glue, and they did not use screws in putting the drywall up. It was simply nailed up, and it was very easy for us to pluck it off. And beneath that, we are finding the shadows, all the things that we hope to find that are going to help us restore the house to its 1965 appearance. Some more interior images as we found it, the bedrooms, the one bathroom that pretty much survived, mostly intact from its early 1950s era. So I want to get into some of the family snapshots now to share some of these and just to show you the details that are helping us along as we sort of make our way through the restoration here. So these photos date from the early to mid 1950s. This is before the Jackson occupation, if you want to call it that. This is the Portlock family was here, possibly at a Christmas time celebration. But what this is showing us is some images of the front room and bits and pieces of furniture that remained in the house, and they were still there in 1965. As I told you, Mrs. Portlock remained with the family as a widow, and she lived with the family to her death in 1968. So these are great sort of early pre-Jackson images that show us the treatment of the front room. Now we're into the late 1950s, and here we have more images of the front room during this beginning of the Jackson period, when they were living there, newly married. Changes start to occur, but kind of gradually. That's, of course, Richie Jean and her mother, Oneida, and that's Sullivan Jackson there, who loved electronics. He had lots of TVs and stereos and was a great, he was a musician and listened to a lot of jazz music. That was a favorite, a love of his. Here we're kind of moving into the early 1960s. Again, showing some more details in the back, the fireplace, the treatment of the tile, even the window treatment, some of the furnishings and things like that, placement here and there. These are, invaluable. The whole point of these snapshots are the person, but we're looking past the person and we're looking at all the great details that are being shared with us in the backgrounds. Still in the early 1960s at Christmas time in the front room. And I'm happy to report the Christmas tree survived. Barely, but it will be making a return this Christmas, Christmas of 26, into the house. More shot, probably into the mid-1960s now. This particular chair is still very much in the collection, and we're seeing that elaborate mirror and sconce over the top of the chair. When the drywall was removed in the front room, the shadows of those things were right there. So those kinds of things we're discovering all the time, and they're going to aid us immensely in placing things along with it. So we're using a combination of Joanna's living memory, interviews that Richie Jean did, oral interviews that she did. We have these historic snapshots that are helping us immensely. We have the actual artifacts, and we have the actual discoveries, within the house as we're peeling back the layers. So this combination is really aiding us quite a bit in how we're going to approach the restoration of the house. Again, more images of that front room, the very famous image from Life magazine. But again, it's showing us details of the carpeting. It's showing us placement of knickknacks and furniture and things like that. Moving into the dining room, this is one of the few lovely formal photographs that we have of the interior of the house. This is during Mrs. Portlock's time, probably sometime in the maybe a little earlier in the mid-50s. So Marie Foster, who was Sullivan Jackson's sister, was also the hygienist for Dr. Portlock, and that's really how the connection was made for Sullivan Jackson to sort of come back into Selma and join that practice. This is a birthday party for Marie Foster's daughter, Rose. That's her front and center, and that's Marie Foster sort of reaching over. Directly behind is Mrs. Portlock. But you can see the treatment of the dining room and probably how it would have looked through most of the 1950s. And as we know from Richie Jean's reminiscence up until the early mid-1960s when she decided, probably in preparation for all the things that she knew was going to happen in the early part of 1965, she did a lot of decorating in the house, including painting most of the wallpaper throughout the house and installing wall-to-wall, brand new wall-to-wall carpeting in the bedrooms and the front room that went all the way back into the back den music room. Here we are pushing further into the mid-1960s. We see in this picture now the newly painted dining room, but the features of the dining room are still very much intact. And here we are beyond the mid-1960s, maybe the early 1970s, the dining room is still intact in this point. So we knew it was going to be very important to restore those features back in, which included that decorative plate rail, the non-functional fireplace at this point with the mantelpiece, and the furnishings, the bits and pieces you see around these rooms, they will be going back into the house. So the kitchen has provided a challenge, but it's really kind of fascinating. Just a small series of snapshots has guided us hugely in the approach to restoring the kitchen. Again, we know Richie Jean in that fall of '64 painted all this wallpaper a bright yellow, but she kept the trim colors the same. The picture here features one of her friends there kind of doing some food preparation. That is the 1950s and earlier refrigerator, sort of further down there. That would be looking from the dining room. And we think might be a washer-dryer combo sitting there in front that they're kind of using as a workspace. On the other side is Sullivan Jackson with one of his friends from Indiana. The kitchen table that was in the nook that would have been behind the woman standing in that picture survives. That would be going back into the house. And the chairs did not survive, but we have found a reproduction version of that. And this is our favorite picture of all time. Not greatly in focus, but it's doing the job for us. This is going to guide us in the restoration of the kitchen. So we know later in the early 1970s, the entire kitchen was gutted, as people do with their kitchens, and was updated into sort of a wooden knotty pine arrangement in the kitchen. So this would be Mrs. Portlock's 1950s redo of the kitchen that we're seeing, but very much in place in 1965. So again, a mid-1960s photo, and based on some of the oral histories, a matching Frigidaire refrigerator and stove was purchased by Joanna and Mr. Jackson sometime in either late 1959 or 1960. And our gurus in the historic appliance realm identified this as a 1959 model Frigidaire. And it's very distinctive with this kind of snowflake pattern that was on the upper freezer door. And it would have had a matching electric stove that would have gone with it. Those will be found and put back into the kitchen. And final shot of the kitchen shows that 1970s redo. Here we have Joanna as a young teenager, and sometime in the early 1970s, probably when this was pretty newly done. The bedrooms, we don't have a huge amount of documentation. We have, again, reminiscence of that. This is Joanna's bedroom, where Dr. King often would sleep. He did sleep kind of all over the house, but in this case, it was not uncommon to have these sort of impromptu meetings. In matter of fact, at one impromptu meeting, Dr. King's brother, who was a fairly large man, and also Reverend Abernathy, got into the bed to discuss things, and their combined weight, the bed was not up to that. It broke and collapsed, which they all thought was great fun, very funny. But It was hastily repaired and propped up with bricks, which stayed with the house. So a few more pictures of that front room. Not a lot of detail, but of course there's the bed, and what we have discovered based on these photos, but other shadows, again, left in the room, is a whole series of these, I guess you call them nursery rhyme cardboard cutouts that are featured in this 1962 Sears Wish Book. So we've identified a bunch of those that were done in vignettes around the room. The room was painted a very light pink, and it had red carpeting by 1965. The middle bedroom, which was the Jacksons' bedroom, you can see the fireplace that originally would have been the heating device. A matching one would have been in Joanna's room as well. Those were long abandoned by probably the 1940s and 50s. But this room acted at times as an impromptu kind of sitting room. These pictures were clearly in the summertime, and the Jacksons were affluent enough to have window air conditioning units. And this room was of a size where they could pile in there, turn up the air, and be comfortable on one of those really dreadful summer Alabama days. So you can see them hanging out in here in that middle bedroom as well. And that room is where Dr. King would often take calls from the White House. There was a bedside phone that was in that room. Another shot of that with a little bit darker pink wall. We have the furniture that you'll see there, and also red carpeting in this area. And finally, the back bedroom, not a lot of documentation for this one. This was Mrs. Portlock's room, who everyone referred to as Mommy, that's what she was called. This room had lavender walls and purple carpeting. And this was the room where King and a lot of his colleagues gathered for a sort of ceremony, a blessing before the start of the successful march. And we see an image from that, kind of an opposite view of the bed. So this would be sort of looking toward the hallway. The back den, we don't have a lot of information. The music room, as we're calling it. This is Richie Jean in later years in that back room. And here she is toward the end of her life. In that same space, but that was another important room. The desk, King would take cat naps. He would kind of get away from things in that particular room. Everyone's interested in the bathrooms. This one is the second bathroom. It survived fairly intact, so we're restoring it to as it would have looked in 1965. Again, back to the front of the house. We don't have any good formal imageries of the house prior to the 1970s. But this gives you a good idea of some of the details of the front. Some of the exterior views, that was Mrs. Portlock's Cadillac there under but this shows you kind of the landscape treatment. Richie Jean's Falcon there in the driveway. Again, Joanna in the period. And this was another very useful set of photographs that showed us some details of the front of the house before it was remodeled. In this case, you can see barely because the colors have changed, but the house is pink. And it has a wooden crisscross railing at the front porch with, if you look to the far corner, you can see there are wooden columns that are holding up the porch. The metal columns would not come into being until the little bit after 1965, maybe in early 66, but we know they weren't there at the time. And here we have probably a 1967, 68 image of Joanna out front with the newly updated iron columns and lovely azaleas across the front being planted there. But the house, you can see, is definitely pink. Quick shout out to Wallace Rayfield, the architect of our house. He was one of the very few formally trained black architects in Alabama, and in the country for that matter. He came through Howard, through Columbia, through Pratt University, and ended up collaborating with Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee, where he really established the architectural design department, the scientific drawing department, and was very much into printing and things like that. So he published all kinds of things about architecture, about different house plans. He designed Dr. Hudson's house, he designed the Jackson house, and he did some also another commission of relatives of the Jacksons in Selma, the Bruegl Dinkins house, which is just around the corner. So he was a builder in Birmingham of churches, of schools, of very nice upscale homes for African Americans. built really the middle-class African-American landscape there in Birmingham. Commissions were 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. This is the Bruegl house before modifications. This is the Bruegl house after the Greenfield modifications. This house still stands in Selma around the corner. Interior of the house. And this is Dr. Hudson's house directly next door to the Jackson house, and it still stands as well in Selma, Alabama. So Greenfield is another sort of interesting character that we'll be able to add to the story of this remarkable family and this remarkable house. So one parting shot of the house as we found it, first time we saw it, and here it is a rendering of the house as it's going to appear in Greenfield Village when we open it in the summer of 2026. So, thank you very much.
So that was an incredible amount of information. These are some brains and some hearts that are working on this project in an incredible way to bring the Jackson home to Greenfield Village, summer 2026. We unfortunately ran out of time, so we went a little long, so we are past our promise to you of ending at noon. So what I'm going to ask my curatorial friends to do is actually to stick around for a little bit of informal questions directly to them instead of asking the audience to step forward to some questions. So they will stick around for a little bit here. Let's thank them again because that was just really incredible. There are also some great opportunities for you if you have time to stick around here in the museum today. So we have some folks just to your left able to talk to you about the Jackson Home Project directly. Behind you at the Genius at Play store, we are offering today the incredible book, The House by the Side of the Road, which is written about the home from the family. Also today, it just started, we have from 12 until 2 our Black History Tour. It is tour at your own pace today to come experience several artifacts around the museum, and also the Jackson House Spotlight. So from your left, just go down the aisleway as if you're going to see sheer genius at the Gallery by General Motors, but instead you'll stop at the Jackson House Spotlight. So tremendous amount going on in the museum today. I would like to thank you all for coming out. Thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. We look forward to unveiling more and more content as this incredible team develops it about the Jackson home. Please stay tuned. Please stay engaged with us. Thank you so much for being here.